Greetings. My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition is again a two-part discussion with the son of the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, Dr. Julius Garvey. We're going to continue our conversation about his father's life legacy. Welcome back.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you for having me again.
Yes.
I guess I wasn't too much of a bomb the first time around. So.
Well, you really shared with us some very key insight, not just in reference to your father, but also the impact of your mom, which not too many people are familiar with. And I think that that's important. And as we kind of really reconnect to your father's legacy, let's talk about that. Talk about his legacy for a moment, the impact.
Well, basically, when my father came to the United States in 1916, this was the 1914-18 war was in progress. And at that time, a number of Americans were participating in the war, so that the labor force was reduced, and this was a time of increased industrialization. Also, there was not able to be immigration from Europe, so the white labor force was down. So in order to have labor for the manufacturing processes, the carpetbaggers, if you will, went south to get black labor. And what was happening in the South at that time was the soil was being exhausted. Of course, it was an agricultural-based economy. There was the boll weevil in terms of the cotton industry itself. So there was extreme poverty in the South, and of course, the African American was at the edge of that poverty scene. So they were very, very happy. Most African American men at that time were very, very happy to move forward because, as you know, also there had been no Reconstruction. Reconstruction was an empty promise. There were no 40 acres on a mule. And there was an abuse of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So large numbers of black people then were being enticed to move north. And the decade from 1915 to 1925, more than 1 million African Americans, largely men, came north to work in the factories in Detroit, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, et cetera, et cetera. So this was the situation of the African American individual and as a group moving from an agricultural base in the South to a manufacturing, an industrial base, if you will, in the North. But what happened really is then they were moving from the plantation to the ghetto because they were marginalized in the North. It was up South, meaning that in terms of living conditions, in terms of what were allowed to do, it was laborers on the railroad tracks, outside labor, etc., maids, servants. They were not allowed to participate really in the technology or the skill set to be advanced within the industry. So, and then in terms of living, like an apartment that was, let's say, a 7-room apartment that was rented to a white family. When they moved out, because black people were moving in, when they moved out, the landlord would cut it up into 7 kitchenettes. So you'd have 7 black families moving into an area, a living area that was one white family. So you can imagine, the turmoil and the exacerbation of emotional, entanglements, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a breeding ground for all kinds of, anger and abuse, and for the young people, going outside the home looking for different things. So we had a population moving from the agricultural South to industrial North, coming up against the prejudices of the North, but wondering then, how does one relate to oneself and to America? This was what was in the air, especially when you're fighting for democracy in the First World War and you're coming back home with your wounds, with your amputations, and in the American uniform, and you're being lynched. So this was the situation that my father encountered and what African Americans encountered. So his organization then was the Universal Negro Improvement Association, African Communities League, which talked about the unity of all African people all around the world, and the necessity of us joining together, building an economic base, and resurrecting, if you will, our culture, African culture, and our African civilization. Now, this caught on like wildfire because there was nothing else to encounter it, so to speak, or to resist it. Because the only other philosophy, if you will, was an integrationist philosophy, which was not sustainable. And of course, if we look back over time, we can discuss the relationship between the two different philosophies. But in any event, my father's approach, spread like wildfire. And, the organization then developed, and in 1920, they had this major convention, which was the first international convention of the Negro peoples of the world, when 2,500 delegates from all over the world, Africa, the Americas, and Central, South America, etc., the Caribbean, came to New York and Liberty Hall, and deliberated on the conditions of African people for the whole month of August. And of course there were parades. Nobody in Harlem had ever seen anything like that. Miles and miles of parade. The African Legion, the Black Cross nurses, the youth organization, the bands, and so on and so forth. They had an opening at Madison Square Garden, where the place was packed and overflowing to outside, more than 25,000 people. Nobody had ever seen that many black people in one place. So, and of course, this caught the eye of the authorities, because here was a man and an organization who was saying, black people unite, we can throw off the colonial bondage, we can throw off the apartheid system in the United States, we just have to join with each other. And of course, this was the time when he announced the shipping company, the Black Star Line, to move goods and services and people between Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States. And this then presented with the apartheid system here, the colonial system of Britain and France, with this dilemma. Here was this black messiah. And of course, we have the internal memo from J. Edgar Hoover in 1919, when he says, we have this leader up in Africa, that is inspiring all these people, and we have to find some way to get him. And of course, the first black FBI agent was hired to infiltrate the Garvey organization. It wasn't just one, there were several. They infiltrated the organization and tried to destroy it from the inside, etc. And then they tried to find something on Marcus Garvey, because here was a man that could pack Madison Square Gardens. Here was a man that could have 2,500 delegates for a month there. And here was a man who, as was happening at that particular time, was inspiring 5 or 6 million people around the world with 1,000 different branches. And of course, there was an economic system with it. There was real estate, the Liberty Halls in different cities, and so on and so forth. They owned their own real estate. They had businesses and so on. There was the newspaper, the publishing company. They were making the first black dolls, and it can go on and on and on and on.
Now, in addition to the impact of Garveyism and the movement on, and the concerns that the government may have had, let's talk about African American leaders, of which may not. So your father was focused on the black independence, self-reliance. There were other leaders such as Du Bois and others who were more in terms of integration, had another approach. Yeah. What were their concerns about your father?
Yeah, there were different ideologies, if you will, doing battle at that time. And of course, one was the communist ideology. Many African Americans of that time saw communism as a way to combat, you might say, the capitalism of the United States. So there were many people who were communists or moved in that direction, even people like Paul Robeson for a long time and so on. And then there was another approach, which was more the integrationist approach, if you will, of a W.B. Du Bois, who had been educated within the system. And then he had his concept of the talented tenth, whereby, if the upper echelons, the top 10% of African Americans were educated and, I guess, kind of, induced into the system, then somehow the system would filter down to everybody else, and somehow that would, create benefits for everybody. But if we look at it over time, that would be similar to a Reaganomics economic system where, okay, you have all these rich people and somehow the wealth is going to trickle down. It never does trickle down. But anyway, so those were the three ideologies. And my father's ideology was that, it was self-identity and self-reliance, and you have to develop your own economic system, because he said anybody who depends on somebody else's for their commerce and industry, sooner or later that group of people will die because they'll be on the periphery and they're not at the center. They're not creating their own systems. And we, as African people, have to create our own systems, because that's the only way we're going to survive into the future.
Now, a lot of times during history, people track the disagreements that Du Bois particularly had with your father in terms of just looking at them in very derogatory ways, and that back and forth, how that impacted our people in terms of deciding which ideology worked best. And I guess the concern is that you had the U.S. government on one side saying or trying to disrupt internally. Then you had our leaders who did not understand the vision of your father at the time, who were saying things publicly in this whole derision in terms of the fight. So you had all of those things happening that kind of played into the undermining of the mission. And so I'm just looking at what point, as I said, when you had this underlining, these undertones, you had all this friction going on, and then this creating these charges. So let's talk about these the individuals who were in the organization for the purpose of disrupting. What were some of the things that were done to create the opportunity for those in government who wanted to find something to kind of move your father off the scene? What were some of the things that happened that led up to his imprisonment?
Louise, basically, many of the leaders of that time, so-called union leaders, because that was one of the ways that African Americans were hoping to get into the unions and then to get into the lower echelons, if you will, of the industrial process. So there were union leaders, there were communist leaders, and there were, I'd say, the ones who were more integrationist in terms of wanting to be a part of the system and imitating the system. And so many of them organized among themselves and wrote to the authorities and saying, Garvey's got to go. There was a movement of Garvey's got to go. And of course, there was the internal divisions that was, fomented, by the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and people were actually sabotaging the ships, the Black Star Line ships. So and then some people were just greedy, and using the organization for their own purposes. So we had a lot of that going on, and then as we mentioned, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, they were always looking for something to try to pin on Garvey, and they came up with the idea of charging him with mail fraud, conspiracy to defraud by using the mail, and of course that was a direct attack on the Black Star Line, because if you can imagine, shipping was the way of commerce at that time. Not like nowadays you have airplanes and so on and so forth, but any intercontinental relationship, was done by ship. So in order for you to have an international organization and unite a group of people internationally, you had to have this means of communication. It's not just by means of newspaper, etc. So once they saw that, then they focused on the Black Star Line to destroy that and to destroy the Garvey movement. So there was the trial, etc. And they had absolutely no evidence, because it turned out that their major witness was somebody who was perjured, and he was coached to perjure himself by the district attorney. So it was really, really bogus, because he never worked at the UNIA office that he said he did, and that was proven in terms of testimony. And then the only evidence was an empty envelope with nothing in the envelope, and nothing to tie the envelope to Marcus Garvey, and the witness couldn't remember exactly what was in the envelope. So it was a complete political trial, if you will. And the whole idea was to get Marcus Garvey, because even though it was supposedly a conspiracy to defraud, nobody else was charged. So where was the conspiracy? You can't have a one-man conspiracy. So again, it was bogus. And, you know, he ended up spending about 2 years and 9 months in Atlanta prison. So, you know, we have been, you know, trying to clear his name, you know, ever since. And it's been a very, very, you know, long process. But I think you can understand that, you know, the authorities, when they see someone who challenges white supremacy, who challenges the type of capitalism that we have, which is, in a sense, a malicious, extractive capitalism that simply sucks out resources at an ever-increasing rate and uses it only for the benefit of a few. That's the type of capitalism that we have. Now, Marcus Garvey had a different type of capitalism. You know, he was definitely not a communist, not a socialist, but he was a capitalist from the perspective, yes, you need capital, just like you need land in terms of farming, you need capital in terms of commerce and industry. But it's a cooperative enterprise, and you share the wealth, and that's very, very African. So this was the basis of his organization. So it was not, you know, it was not communist, and it was not voracious capitalist, but it was definitely an African type of capitalism, if you will. So when you look at somebody then who was challenging the system, but in terms of how it was structured, then you understand why they set out to destroy him. And if you look at all of the leadership, the black leadership that has come since then, everyone that has stood up and understood the basis of the system has been destroyed. Malcolm X was destroyed. And, you know, I think everybody is familiar with that story, how he was destroyed on the inside and also from the outside, and the conspiracy to kill him. Martin Luther King, once he understood the system, and he said that, you know, the Vietnam War, this is unconscionable. You know, we're killing brown people over there and using resources that we need to transform this country to make it more equitable for all people. We need those resources here. And then, you know, he took up the Poor People's March on Washington. Once they saw that he was now attempting to change the system, here was another black messiah who was going to change the system. He was destroyed.
Now, let's talk about now the move afoot. And I know you, and I'm sure your brother also, were about trying to clear your father's name. I know that you, during as the Obama administration ended, you had put forth an appeal. Talk to us about that in terms of what happened then and what you're planning to do now in terms of...
Yes. Well, basically, both myself and my brother, we've been involved in this for a long, long time. And we might say formally since about 1987, which was my dad's centennial. And where we appeared before the House Judiciary Committee in Washington. You know, John Conyers was then head of the House Judiciary Committee, and he had us there with a number of historians, people such as, you know, Tony Martin and Rupert Lewis and Judith Stein, giving testimony on to the whole bogus nature of the trial and the true nature of what Marcus Garvey was trying to do in terms of the organization. And, you know, that didn't get out of the House Judiciary Committee. But John Conyers, you know, continued. And then, of course, Congressman Rangel, you know, picked up the cudgel, and we worked with him, with his office. And almost annually, over a long period of time, he would have a House resolution to try to clear my dad's name over and over and over and over. But again, with no result, you know. So we took up the battle even more personally, shall we say, in 2016, because we figure, okay, we have an African American president. You know, he can use the posthumous pardon as a way to clear his name. And you know, we hired a law firm, a very prestigious law firm in Washington D.C. They had gone through the trial, et cetera, et cetera. And you know, we presented all of that to the Obama administration, and really with no results forthcoming. There was no statement as to why or anything like that. There was just a big silence. So now at the present time, you know, we have Yvette Clarke, who is a congresswoman, and she has put forward House Resolution, I think it's 148, which is now an attempt again to bring this up and to clear his name. So hopefully now with a new administration and a Democratic administration, you know, we will lend as much support as we can, individually, etc., to move this forward. And certainly we would, you know, like, you know, all people who are interested in justice, to stand up and take note and put their 2 cents in, if you will, in terms of their own congresspeople or whatever access they have to any aspect of the power structure, you know, to try to bring this about. Because it's symbolic in a very real way, you know, of how African people in America and around the world have been oppressed. I was going to say down-pressed, but that's my Rastafarian influence, you know, the down-pressure. But how we have been oppressed over time. And then people turn around and say, gee, you know, why don't you pull yourself up by your bootstraps? Every time that we attempt to do this, somebody gets killed or marginalized or disrupted, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no desire for us to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. There's no desire for us to pull ourselves up at all, you see, because that is the way of white supremacy. White supremacy can only function if there is black inferiority. So that is guaranteed within the system.
I understand that, like you said, there is a movement afoot by a congresswoman in Brooklyn. And is there other things, like for those, like you mentioned about those people who are sitting on the other side of the tube watching this program, who may themselves feel like you do, that, hey, it's about time that Marcus Messiah Garvey's name is cleared, that he was a victim of racism, about a person on a vendetta, that to destroy, dismantle, disrupt Africa, you know, that what can be done to rectify the wrong. And so those on the other side, should they contact this congresswoman? Should they contact their what do you feel?
Yes, definitely. You know, I would like to see the whole New York delegation really sign on to this, not just Yvette Clarke, and went all the way from Chuck Schumer, et cetera, et cetera. And also Governor Cuomo, if you will. I mean, you know, New York certainly was his home base in terms of Harlem, you know, back in the day in the 20s and so on. So I would like to see the whole New York Democratic delegation be a part of this and pushing it. And I think if New York pushes it, I think the rest of the country will go along with it. So I would ask anybody listening who has any, you know, political clout or other clout, religious or otherwise, you know, to use that to influence, you know, their Democratic Congress people, senators, et cetera, to support this bill that is before the Congress at the present time.
Yes. If you can summarize some of the things that, you know, as you project forward in terms of what you would like to see happen, if you had a chance to pick 3 things that you would like to see in preservation of the enduring legacy of your dad, what would it be?
Well, I think, you know, in terms of the legacy of my dad, I would like to see, basically what my dad fought for. And he called it the redemption of Africa, or the redemption of African people. So that I'd basically like to see a United States of Africa. I'd basically like to see that African people have liberated their minds from mental slavery, because that was what he talked about. And he realized that while, other people can free our bodies, we have to be the ones to free our minds. And that is still something that is very, very much lacking at the present time. We have not freed our minds from mental slavery. For example, it was Vernon Jordan that presented this petition to President Obama. Now, Vernon Jordan is not, he was representing the law firm that he worked at, etc. But he was a major person within the Democratic Party. Now, but still that was ignored. So we have to understand that we stand on the shoulders of people who were gone before, and we have to honor those people in terms of our own understanding of who we are, because if we can't honor our ancestors, it means that we don't honor ourselves. So that we need to get to that stage where we're honoring ourselves as a free African people and a United States of Africa that recognizes the diaspora as the sixth region.
We understand that you represent, even though many people, unfortunately, generations did not have the privilege of being in the presence of your illustrious parents, but you are the embodiment of them, and we're so honored and we're so thankful for your dedication and your commitment, and we hope to continue to support you in your quest to keep the legacy alive and to see these missions become a reality. So on behalf of Cultural Caravan, we want to salute your work, your family, for your contributions to our continual legacy.
Well, thank you so much, Louise, for having me, and thank you for your upholding African culture in your own unique way. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this broadcast, and we continue to encourage you to tune in, to write, and to tell a friend. And please visit our website at www.ccptv.org. But until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you.